You're listening to Breakpoint This Week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Today we're going to talk about a new piece dissecting major cultural shifts around the world. We're also going to talk about, on a smaller scale, cultural shifts happening within the Evangelical Church in America. So we have a lot of stuff to get to today. We're so glad you're with us. Stick around. Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. John, I don't know if you were near Chicago this week for the DNC. I know you like to go and support them in all their endeavors. But it was there were a lot of free services offered at the DNC this week. There was food and drink and free abortions and vasectomies. So they really were covering the gamut this week. Nothing says we're the party that cares about children like offering free abortions and vasectomies. They might as well have put up a sign that was like, please do not procreate, please.
I want everyone here to know that we had committed beforehand not to talk about this. And the temptation is just too great.
It's like an SNL skit. The fact that they would do, it's so pandering and gross and weird and upsetting. But
look, there's a sneak preview, Breakpoint commentary coming out specifically on this point and specifically on what has happened in the 30 years from safe, legal, and rare to free abortions and vasectomies out front. And, it's important to note this was a Planned Parenthood offering, not a DNC offering. Although the daylight between the two organizations is pretty thin. But we're going to talk about something else because we talked about politics last week.
Yeah, that's true.
I had so hoped. Yeah, and I knew it was going to be irresistible. So hoped to come into today and not talk about politics. And so we're not going to. No, we're not going to. We're not going to.
Right. Okay. Very good.
You agree?
I agree.
All right.
Pinky promise.
All right.
I want to talk about major cultural shifts. And I think this is a little sneak peek of it. It's an evidence of it. But there was a piece that you shared with me this week by John Seel, who's, he has an MDiv and he's also a cultural critic, talking about major seismic sort of cultural shifts that he sees playing out across the entire world, not just the Western world and not just the developed world. And this piece is another kind of way of making sense of the strange things we're seeing, like, for example, free abortions outside of a major political party convention. So he lists a handful of civilizational shifts. He lists 4 of them, and I'm going to read these to you. And then I want to hear if you think this is an accurate representation of where we are right now. So shift 1 is the world has shifted from a Christian to a post-Christian world. So this is a world functionally divorced from any reference to the sacred. So he's not only even just talking about Christianity there, he's talking about sort of the shift from anything sacred, from looking outward to looking inward, as you've characterized it before. Shift 2 is from classical liberalism to Nietzschean nihilism. So the idea of individual rights kind of being subsumed into state power. Shift number 3 is from the global West to the global East. And he's right. There's a really interesting sentence in here about when you think spiritually now, when you're talking about spiritualism, people are more often talking about Eastern spiritualism than Western religion. And shift number 4, he says, is from Enlightenment rationalism to post-Enlightenment enchantment, which seems contradictory to the, from Christian to post-Christian, but I don't think it is. He's saying we are rejecting forms of Enlightenment rationalism in favor of a more enchanted form of spirituality. And then he quotes Leslie Newbegin. The churches of Europe and their cultural offshoots in the Americas had largely come to a kind of comfortable cohabitation with the Enlightenment. And there did not seem to be any contradiction in the combination of modern education, medicine, and technology with the proclamation of the gospel, end quote. But with the rejection of Enlightenment rationalism, with its association with secularism and disenchantment, has come the rebirth of a wide variety of older and new forms of enchantment, like neo-paganism and the occult, which is surprising, but I think is inarguable that is absolutely happening. So do you think that this is a kind of an accurate representation of where we're sitting right now?
Well, yeah, look, I was fascinated by this piece. First of all, John Seel is a very, very sharp thinker. I've known him for several years. It's been a long time since I've talked to him, but I come across his writing and come across some things that he says or, in various places. And this was on Aaron Wren's Substack. And I think what makes that notable is that, of course, Aaron Wren has kind of done a "you are here" sort of analysis in this, what he called this shift to the negative world, from the positive to the neutral to the negative world. So that was an attempt to try to put a little framing on this. And a lot of people are doing that. And I think it's notable that a lot of people are doing that because it says something about the felt need. I think that's below the surface for a lot of people of faith and even just a lot of people in the Western world. Like, people sense something is going on. I'm working on a project right now with the wonderful and brilliant Guinness, who's also kind of been helping for a long time. Folks understand, what is it that we're sensing? What is it that we're feeling? You're not alone. You're not weird. This isn't one of those kind of phantom vibrations that we all have because of the cell phone, age, where we think of the phone's buzzing, but it's not. Like, something's buzzing. And it's reflecting something really real. And I honestly think he's right in the very first line of this piece that I want to read. Our book on culture, Brett Kunkle and I talked about culture and talked about culture like water, using the analogy of water, and particularly the ocean. And we distinguished between the waves and the undercurrents. And that's probably an understatement way of saying what John Seel says here in this piece. But the difference between waves and undercurrents is you feel waves, right? When a wave hits you, depending on how big it is, it can, surprise you. It can make you laugh. It can make you hurt. If you're in an undercurrent, you can be shifted dramatically and not even notice until you look up and you're like, where's my stuff? Because I was just down here on the beach and now I'm all the way down here on the beach and we've moved. And I think, depending on how long we've played kind of in this shifting undercurrents of Western civilization, how long it's been since we've looked up. There are people that are sensing that something's pretty dramatic. Here's how John Seel puts it. We're not in an age of change, but a change of age. Now, that sounds dramatic. It's Gandalfian, you kind of feel like there should be music behind it. When you start talking about the age of, typically when historians or sociologists name an age, they're looking at a dramatic shift, right? The Industrial Revolution changes the population from, farm to factory, from rural to urban, from largely homogenous to very much diverse. There's all kinds of things that industrialization meant. I've talked about in the past all the things that in the shift of the information age means. But, the other way to look at this is pre-modern, modern, postmodern, and what that means. The other way to look at this is this kind of post-Christian. And, that's the first shift that John Seel talks about here, this shift from Christian to post-Christian, which people have been writing about that for a really long time. But it's one thing to talk about we're abandoning our Christian beliefs, right? This is, becoming secularized, or as Charles Taylor talked about it, disenchanted, modern. But when you start untethering from all the implications of Christian faith, things that you don't even realize. I was talking to a group of students last night about, this idea of human dignity. When you start untethering human dignity from the only thing that ever gave it to the world in the first place and start trying to tether it to other things, the consequences of that are pretty dramatic. And so, let me just begin by saying I'm appreciating, even if I don't fully agree, I'm appreciating with the "you are here" sorts of analysis that are being offered, because I think we need it. When you feel unstable, you need a "you are here." You need the map. You need to know, here's where these things are. Here's where you are. It's a different map maybe than you thought. And that's what this piece, I think, identifies. And I think he's trying to communicate something, that the shift really is dramatic. Are we in a change of age? That's a big statement. I think it's a really clever way to say it. I think it's a very helpful, at least to take seriously. that we feel kind of shaky in the knees, not because the ground has shifted or is shifting and continues to be shifting. The next thing that I'll say is because, his next point is the shift from classical liberalism to Nietzschean nihilism. You and I have talked a lot about the parable of the madman and this kind of predictive piece from Nietzsche about what the death of God eventually is going to entail. And you remember he goes on this epic rant that we've lost our definitions of up and down. We've lost our source of comfort and warmth with the death of God. We don't know what progress is anymore. All this is going to have to change. Somebody's going to have to become God, to take his place. All these things are part of the madman. And then he, writing in the late 1800s, he has his madman stop and go, "Oh, I'm too soon. Like, this is coming, but they're not ready to hear this. It's inevitable, but it ain't yet." He didn't use the word ain't, but you get the point. Here we are in kind of the existential realization of Nietzsche's prediction. Now, he's talking about something a little bit different, which, as you mentioned, individual rights to state power. It was the advancing of individual rights, untethered from any sort of ordered freedom, which is, again, leaning here on Os Guinness's analysis in A Free People's Suicide, when he analyzes this abuse of the concept of freedom, from freedom for to freedom for goodness and truth and beauty, freedom for flourishing to freedom and according to a design with therefore strictures and structures and borders and boundaries, to a freedom from restraint, consequences, nature. That has to be secured by state power. So it really was the abuse of individual liberty that leads to the loss of liberty. And that's what Oz predicted in his book, that the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. I have, in describing that kind of, I try to add a little nuance there, that the greatest enemy of freedom is poorly defined freedom. It's misunderstood freedom. It's this shift from freedom for to freedom from. It's a huge shift. And that's what he's talking about. And I literally was just having this conversation again with this group of students. I was teaching over at Summit Ministries last night, talking about marriage and family. And it just struck me again in the middle of this conversation with them, that the separation of sex, marriage, and babies, the divorce of sex, marriage, and babies from each other, seeing all of them as individual kind of rights that we can claim or not claim and do or not do, really to take that as far as we've taken it. For example, a couple that has chosen to be engaged and committed in a sterile relationship demanding the right to children.
You're talking about homosexuality.
That's what I'm talking about, same-sex marriage, which, by the way, was advanced by arguing that marriage and procreation are no longer hitched because this is a freedom from. It's a freedom from design, right? You've chosen a relationship that is non-procreative and are now demanding children on the backside. How do you do that? You need technology and you need the state. So the state securing it through insurance policies, and the technology gives it to you through, going around, we're doing workarounds to nature. And that's the sort of thing here I think he's talking about. I think that freedom analysis is aging well, I guess. Yeah. Because he's right on that.
One of the other things this piece makes me think of is the importance of stories that happen, like actual circumstances that we can't foresee that change things like culture and worldview among people. I'm listening to this huge series on the French Revolution from The Rest is History, Tom Holland's podcast. And that's one of the themes that they sort of come back to, because first of all, one of the main drivers of the cultural shifts before and after the French Revolution were narratives. This was around the time when, people are writing serials and sending, so story was really captivating back then, more so than it had been in previous eras. In part because of the technology to spread, the printing press and spreading the information around. But also there was just a confluence of events that nobody could have predicted that led to major shifts. And one of the examples they talk about is that the extortion of Marie Antoinette by the jeweler that story of there was a necklace and they claimed that she had bought it and then not paid for it. And then when that became news, they were basically trying to extort her for money. And when that became news, it led to this huge outcry that she's spending all this lavish money and that she's not even paying her debts. And that led to another thing. And I think we're seeing that here too. So all of the cultural shifts that John Seel's talking about and that you're talking about are not necessarily inevitabilities like etched in stone from the beginning of the world. A lot of them also happen because of stories that we tell ourselves or circumstances that come up. And that's, that cause these major shifts. And I think that's important because countering these things, and I appreciate that at the end of this piece, John Seel talks about like, why is this important to know? This isn't just, fun to sit and talk about or theorize. We need to know this as a church because these are people that we want to reach. And this is a world that we want to be based in reality and, that's not trying to fight it because that's a better world for everybody. So, it's important to know that. And I think it's important to know and recognize the stories that are happening in front of us and what we're telling ourselves, because at the end of the day, those are the things that persuade people. It's like every time you've brought this up when we've talked about abortion in the past, where people say, the exceptions, I think, to abortion should be rape, incest, in my case. And that's kind of a distillation of what I'm getting at, which is there's theorizing about the world, and then there's the actual stories and circumstances that happen to us and in front of us. And those tend to be the most persuasive things. And with, the world the way it is right now and how fast information travels and how vast our access to information is, there's stories everywhere. And that is more persuasive, I think, than a lot of, than they maybe even used to be, even in the era of the French Revolution.
Maybe I've thought about that. I was having the conversation this week with a friend and we were going back and forth on a little bit of this. And I think your reference to the French Revolution, I think some people talk about kind of apologetics in a negative world or Christianity and, to use the Aaron Ren's framing or, in this kind of brave new world, what does it mean to do Christian cultural witness or Christian witness? What does it mean? What is activism? He mentions here, by the way, that, one of the attempts to this kind of deal with the Nietzschean, nihilism is you're not just seeing it with the growth of state power on the left. You're also seeing voices on the right saying we should get rid of the First Amendment. It hasn't been good for us. We have to get rid of, being winsome and nice and, because it doesn't work. And by the way, winsome doesn't work. I agree with that. We don't. You speak in a way that respects the dignity of other people. It's not a pragmatic, sort of exchange. There is this, oftentimes those who are talking about this emphasize the power of story as if it's something new, as if it's not something that, Jesus did 2,000 years ago and getting his point across. What is unique now is when you divorce story from reality or story from facts and present it as if the world is a social construct. So my story of struggling with being born in this body then means that sex and gender, that sex is assigned and gender is non-binary. That suddenly now you're, instead of using stories to communicate realities on the ground, stories create reality. Mm-hmm. And that becomes, I think, something new. But I think even more, or in addition to what you just said, I wanted to add this. I also appreciated that there was a little bit of, hey, here's why these shifts matter. And it's not just so that you can, talk about it and have fun with it. I mean, I nerd out on this stuff. I really do. Because it was a big part of me coming into this calling, which, people often ask, how did you get to do this? And I'm like, I have no idea. There was like no plan, no strategy. But I was fascinated with the kind of thoughtful side of faith, and also then not just using faith as a antagonistic posture towards the culture, but as a lens through understanding culture. And that took kind of a philosophical bent early on, which is let's compare these different ways of thinking about life in the world. And these are the only ways it works. And it was very kind of theoretical to starting to see the sociological and cultural realities. And sociology has, really taken a godless turn for decades, right, now. But when you have those Christian categories applied to things like how are people understanding identity, and how is it that we're reframing our institutions, and what is this idea of enchantment and disenchantment? I mean, these are very profound tools of what, sociologists call plausibility. Why are things that were unbelievable yesterday unquestionable today? Where's that shift happen? That's why it's important, I think, to think in terms of shifts and not just in terms of waves. The way, to mix my metaphors from earlier, when we know we're getting hit by waves, right? Parents know this. I go back to the conversation I had with the parents from Michigan whose child was being transed under their watch by people they thought that were their friends at the school board. And they're just like, I mean, I knew it was happening, but I didn't know it was happening here. And you get hit by a wave and you know it. And I think a lot of Christians are responding to those waves. That's what happens when things become, people think in overly political terms. Everything's an issue. And by the way, there are issues and there are political realities. I think we're really clear, like we need political engagement in that. But we don't want to play cultural whack-a-mole. We don't want to just, you can just feel like I'm going to smack this and smack this. The shifts explain where these waves come from. And also the shifts help us understand context. In other words, the reason you need to understand these shifts and start to make sense of them is because this is the new context through which you will love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. As John Seel puts it in the article, most importantly, this is the world you are discipling your kids for.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it makes me think of something I think Keller said, which is, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but like very liberally here. But it's one thing to think like our biggest burden as as makers of disciples is to show people that there was a man named Jesus who was God and he rose from the dead, like whether that was true or not. And in my own life and heart, that is the most important thing. Like, is it true? Because if it is, then I know what I'm going to do. And it is, by the way, it is true. But we've kind of shifted into, okay, if that's true, is that good? Do I want that to have been what happened? And what's the implications of it? And is that actually good news, or can I just pretend it didn't happen because I'd rather it hadn't?
Yeah.
That's the place we're at now.
Yeah, that's a good example of it. I mean, the other thing to realize too, and I think John says this pretty well here, is if you're in the middle of a shift, you feel it. If you're on the tail end of the shift, it's a new normal.
Totally.
So it is culture's most powerful, not where it's loudest, but where it normalizes. So on the tail end of this is the fish that don't know they're wet reality for our children. So this task of contextualization, which has been talked about in mission for a long time, has to be done in the context of parenting, has to be done in the context of our own faith journeys. So he applies it here specifically to, it's going to change how we think about parenting. It's got to change how we think about missions. That's what I think is interesting, that the West has moved from the locus of Christianity to maybe the source, or maybe the home of the largest unreached people group in the world. That's a pretty stark way of saying it. But he's not. I might quibble with a little bit, but he's definitely saying something that we need to pay attention to. And then it's going to challenge our sense of identity. The pull of secularization, and I don't mean in the modern way, but in the postmodern way, is going to be so dramatic that the task of cultivating and developing a Christian worldview, the task of being formed in the truth, is going to be way more uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable, kind of in the sense of, underground church needing to be fully committed. But what does that look like in the terms of such great pressure? And that, of course, then turns around and says, if your interest is in discipling your children, my friend Larry Taylor, the president of ACSI, we were just talking yesterday too, and he always says this, and I so appreciated this years ago when I first heard it, and it takes on additional meaning when I read pieces like this, is that, what we do in our homes is the practice. The game is what happens out there, and you don't practice for the Olympics by playing pickup. We've got to get more serious about upping the game, within the church, within our homes, to match the challenge that they're going to reach. And, this is a good piece. So listen, I know we need to move on to the next shift that we're going to talk about, which is not the one happening outside, but the one happening inside the church, which we're going to get in lots of trouble for. So let's jump in. But the article is called A Change of Age, America and the West Stand at a Civilizational Inflection Point. We'll link to it on the website and in our show notes. But it's on Aaron Wren's Substack by Dr. John Seel. And shout out to John. Great job with this piece. Really thought-provoking and I think helpful.
John, in the last segment, we were talking about sort of major seismic cultural shifts across the world. I want to get a little bit more granular and talk about cultural shifts happening inside the evangelical church, particularly in the United States. So there's a big book that came out recently kind of talking about a leftward drift in evangelicalism. And I'm wondering if you see that happening. So I don't want to get into individuals or motives or even politics, but just generally speaking, do you think there is a ideological leftward drift within American evangelicalism?
Well, I don't know if that's the case or not. Maybe. I pay attention to these things, and I think all of us have a story. All of us have a set of anecdotes that suggest yes or no on this. I think for most of us, it would suggest yes. Like, yeah, there's been a leftward drift. I mean, if I'm just looking at my own anecdotes, I would say absolutely there's been a leftward drift.
Yeah, same.
But I want to dig behind that a little bit more. But let me give you a couple of the anecdotes. Now that my wife has a growing and successful podcast called Strong Women, between the two of us, we get so many books every week mailed to us by people. And we love books. We are keeping Goodwill stocked up down the street, but just by having to kind of, funnel things through the best we can. But my anecdote is that in most of the major Christian publishers, first of all, have been bought by secular publishing houses.
Mm-hmm.
I heard from an exec at another Christian publishing house earlier this week, who was not bought by one of those, that has affected things. Now, that's his take on it. I don't have the visibility inside. He described a little bit about what the process looks like inside. I don't have the visibility. Here's what I know, that when it comes to these publishing houses publishing books by authors dealing with this connection between Christians and culture or Christians and political stances, I'll get anywhere between 10 pushing a perspective that leans left or goes strong left for every one that goes right.
And so let me just point out, that's being sent to you. So imagine a person who is actually progressive and what, I mean,
that's right. I maybe 10-1 is strong. I mean, look, I've gotten 3 in the last couple years dealing with something like the Second Amendment. Now, there's stuff about the First Amendment as well. There's other analyses that are way more kind of in the, neutral, trying to make sense of it. And some of those are actually really helpful, and, they're above the political fray, trying to do different things. But I'm talking about the ones that jump right into the political fray. And when they say these books, and again, I'm talking at least maybe 10-1 was strong, maybe 5-1 is more accurate. The ones that really get into an issue that you could consider to be in the political fray, a big cultural issue that has big political ramifications, I'm not getting any that are pushing Christians right. I'm getting the ones that are pushing Christians left, and they're sending it to me. They clearly have to know, right? I've gotten 3 on the Second Amendment. So gun rights, and 3 in the last, couple years that suggest that for Christians to love their neighbor means we should push extended gun control and reject this idea of the Second Amendment in one form. It needs to be reframed, reunderstood, and Christians should be behind that as a way of loving their neighbors. Very similar to the argument, well, look, you may not like this, but you should, mask up. You should take the vaccine. You should, this is a way of loving the neighbor. You do it for others. Now, listen, no question that Christian ethics is focused on others. First of all, God, and then others. So the fact that, somebody wants to make that argument about the Second Amendment, particularly in a nation that has so much gun violence, and so on, my point is I haven't gotten a single book saying that really the problem with gun violence, for example, in inner cities is a problem of X, Y, and Z that's more fundamental. And to love your neighbors, you may need to be prepared, for example, to protect them in some sort of situation. And therefore, and even more than that, I can't even imagine. I would be so shocked to get a book from these same publishers that somehow made the argument loving your neighbor means being pro Second Amendment. It's just not even in the ballpark. I just would never get that. I'll give you another anecdote. So in other words, 5-1, and this isn't a scientific survey, but 5-1, the books that I'm getting from major Christian evangelical publishing houses that deal with issues having to do in the political fray are pushing left 5-1 for every pushing right, which I look at that and say, it's just so interesting when you hear the critique always being the political right. Evangelicals have been captivated by the political right. That's not the push that I'm feeling. Another example, universities, Christian colleges and universities. Anecdotally, again, Christian school, high school principal, not would anyway be considered, politically astute or really pushing, kind of leaning politically right. I think would pretty much sit pretty solidly in the evangelical mainstream. Probably would be personally pro-life, not really sure what that looks like publicly. I'm just telling you who this person is. Told me that as a high school principal at a Christian school, they're not able to hire graduates from a well-known prominent Christian university. And I said, why? And it had anything to do with the fact that, because they're too Trumpy or they're too trapped in the culture wars. It was specifically she specifically referred to CRT and LGBTQ issues. That on those two issues, they are unorthodox out of this school. You go to Evangelicals for Harris, that group. I mentioned this on the World and Everything in It podcast. Now, there's been an Evangelicals for Biden. There's been an Evangelicals for Obama. There's been all of those. I looked at this list, and I haven't done the direct comparison, so maybe I'm wrong on this. I probably should go back before I say this. I knew some of the folks who jumped on the Evangelicals for Biden. I disagreed with it. I don't understand how you could do it. I had conversations with folks who led this group. Mostly it wasn't an Evangelicals for Biden group. If you looked at it, it was an Evangelicals against Trump. That was really what it should have been called. But you could at least say on their theological beliefs, they were evangelical. They at least had a high view of Scripture, maybe not inerrancy, but a high view of Scripture. They, whatever, believed in, Jesus actually rising from the dead, and relatively orthodox view of things like sexuality and so on. You look at the Evangelicals for Harris list, there's people on that list that are just neo-pagan. They're not They're not even evangelicals by the new kind of constantly moving target of what an evangelical actually is.
Right.
I mean, certainly not David Bebbington's definition. They're nowhere near. If that's the bullseye, they're not even. They're throwing the dart in the opposite direction. They're throwing the dart in the direction that Jesus was sinful and probably homophobic. I mean, it's just not even close. And so you look at this and you say, well, but on that list, on that same list, are people who would have been a part of that Evangelicals for Biden list, and you're like, you're calling someone else an evangelical who is, it's just not even, I mean, when J. Gresham Machen talked about liberal Christianity being a different religion, we're now talking about a different God. We're talking about a different view of sin, salvation, resurrection, Holy Scripture, everything. We're not even in the ballpark anymore and calling that evangelical. So that's my third anecdote.
My question for you is, how much of this do you attribute to the rise in sort of, because of the internet and the way we take in information now? The fact that so many pastors not only are pastoring their own local church, but are speaking to a much wider audience. And so, I go to my small, 120 person church every Sunday, and 80% of us are not only listening to our pastor, but throughout the week, we're hearing from big name other pastors or other media outlets or whatever. And those forces are shaping us too. How much of this sort of leftward drift, I'm thinking every time there's a story in the, big sort of culture-y story in the news, you'll hear a handful of people saying, you better demand that your pastor talks about this Sunday. where it's this sort of like every local church is not local anymore. You're a global church, even though there's 120 of you on the south side of your city,
Yeah, this may be in the category of, as a friend likes to put it, it ain't one thing, it's everything. And that's one of the things. And this isn't new. So, people have written back of the drifts within evangelicalism, either to the political right in the 80s or to moral scandal that we saw kind of on a popular level. And a lot of that stuff continues to be uncovered even today, whether it's in kind of, televangelist empires or, these kind of, programs to deal with troubled kids or camps or whatever, that, there was some bad stuff that took place in there, and it was hidden and passed on. And there's enough of those stories so this was more than just one off here and one off there. There was actually a good bit of stuff that needed to be addressed. Evangelicalism has always been, to quote Mel Gibson's speech in The Patriot at the South Carolina legislature, his character, why would we trade one king 1,000 miles away for 1,000 kings 1 mile away? That's kind of evangelicalism, rejecting some sort of hierarchy and then a bunch of, little centers of gravity. And within those centers of gravity, there arose, leaders, strong leaders. And some of these leaders were anointed and called and amazing. And often in that fallen state often can lead to kind of little fiefdoms, little papacies, within evangelicalism. So the unaccountability that was allowed structurally to emerge clearly caused a problem. Now, I often have joked with one of my friends as someone who is part of a more hierarchical church in the Anglican Church, that, all you got to do is have a hierarchy and everything's, you solve all those problems, which is a joke because every system has problems. And, the Church of England, and by the way, I'm not part of the Church of England, where I don't want to go through the whole Anglican, all the acronyms there that need to be fleshed out. But the Church of England this week is talking about dropping the word church, which everyone joked, that's going to be an odd name of England. What does that mean? I don't know if you saw that story. It's just crazy. I don't even know what to make of it. I don't even know if it's real or somebody made it up. That's the thing, is like, it's like the, abortion clinic and the vasectomies outside, free vasectomies outside the DNC. It's like, is this parody or is this real?
Surreal,
okay, this is real. Now we got to, it's hard to keep up. But, that's one of the realities, the how the systems were set up. I think then as that moved from the 80s into the 90s, from really these kind of radically autonomous and individual sort of situations around big leaders to a more kind of business-driven, market-driven, the seeker-sensitive model and that sort of stuff, and the use of marketing technique, that is actually something that goes back in evangelicalism. A lot of people want to start in the 90s. But people have written about the First Great Awakening and how innovative it was to use newspapers. Now, maybe the reason people didn't use newspapers before that is there weren't that many. Now there was a bunch. And using newspapers changed the game. Using radio changed the game at the beginning. Using kind of big events, building a building to have a revival service. These are uniquely American evangelical things. There's some expressions of it outside of America, but it really takes hold in America, these innovations. And evangelicals are innovative. It's one of the best things about them. They were, ready to claim all these things for Jesus. So radio, that's great. Now we can shoot the gospel into the, Soviet Union. Television, that's great. We can actually reach people all around the world. The internet, that's great. TikTok, now we can get more people. And so now theologians and thought leaders have been replaced by influencers, right? So now you're like, well, is that good or is that bad? Who are the influencers accountable to? You know what they'll say? Their followers.
Yeah.
That's not how this works. And so there is, I think, in terms of the leftward drift, I think you have to dig deep into kind of some of these realities where accountability was designed to be in the context of the local church. This is why I'm more convinced than ever why next year's national conference for the Colson Center is the church being the church. And I don't just mean like, kind of in some esoteric kind of missional way. I mean, we need to get back to this is, as a friend says, God's plan A. There's not a plan B. And so there's a way in which the innovations and so on become no longer plan A and become plan B. And I feel that acutely as the head of a nonprofit, because listen, nonprofits are innovations, right? So what does it mean for us to come alongside and serve the church and not try to go around the church with something that has been incredibly successful and grown, like the Colson Fellows program, right? Where, from 50 in 2016 fellows, looking at, thinking about getting serious about Christian discipleship in this context to, 1,700 right now that have started. And by the way, growth has sideswiped businesses, it's sideswiped nonprofits, it's sideswiped churches, sideswiped groups. It's very easy then to get outside of local accountability. I think accountability is a big thing. I think the celebrity-driven approach to things because of entertainment, Neil Postman's analysis, all of this basically untethers popular Christianity. And so when we talk about a rightward drift or a leftward drift, I think that is where it becomes very, very easy to do. Now, I think there's also this reality that because we live in such a highly politicized moment where things are seen almost purely in political terms, that means the polarization towards either side. If somebody is wrong on this, that means they must be wrong on everything. So we've got, people being criticized for drifting left who haven't drifted left on theology, haven't drifted left on some of the bigger social issues like marriage, sexuality. They would be courageous and outspoken on being opposed to abortion, and also they want to also bring alongside support for women. And, they want to protect children from being, aggressively indoctrinated to question who they are, to question their own bodies, but maybe they have stepped up and, during the pandemic and said something like, I think we should get a vaccine in order to love neighbor. And others, they were convinced by this particular idea. I think that was, used and driven, by people in power. I don't want to make a conspiracy. I've had this long conversation with my kid this week, Maria, and this is a kind of a side point, but I'm adopting this philosophy that a former colleague used to say, never chalk up to conspiracy what can be explained by just sheer incompetence. Mm-hmm. I have a child going through some really interesting things with some authorities in her life, and we're in the middle of it too, and we're trying to help her walk through it. And it's so easy to go to conspiracy. And then if you just back up one step forward, you're like, this is just incompetence,
Which is kind of, depending on the context, can be comforting a little bit, because then you feel like, well, if I just say no to this thing, then if it's incompetence, that's a lot easier than if somebody has like a sinister agenda, they're going to push back.
And I'm not saying that there isn't kind of planning and attempting. Like I do think, for example, we know this. There was a game plan from the HRC to move businesses. And when you move businesses in a cultural moment, it affects everyone. It affects the government. It affects churches. It affects individual consumers. And we've seen the leftward drift of businesses. And that was intentional and planned and executed. And that is a way to change people's mind. Not because they've joined the conspiracy. It's just because they're influenced.
Yeah, that's how it works. That's okay in a sense. It's not okay if you're pushing a false ideology or, false ideas that are going to ultimately harm people, but trying to influence other people for your cause is normal.
Right. Yeah. That's right. And you can do it through levers of power. And I think that's one of the kind of the highlights of this. But I don't want to get back to, I just want to make sure we get back to, as we think about the leftward drift and evangelicalism. Evangelicalism is so diverse, right? You have pastors, you have institutions, you have historic institutions and brand new innovations. You now have influencers. That's a new thing. And you've also got big church pastors, small church pastors. You got nonprofits. You've got political nonprofits. You got distinctly non-political nonprofits. You got people trying to help the poor. You got people trying to help the sick. You got people trying to help the, incarcerated and their families. You've got all of these different categories of individuals. You've got language that's being demanded through all of this. I use the word incarcerated. There are groups that like that. There are groups that don't like that. You've got groups, that are working with the state. You've got works that are definitely not working with the state. You've got institutions that have been co-opted by embracing federal funds. You've got other institutions that are like, we're never going to get in bed with that no matter what. The diversity is just absolutely incredible. And the political overlay means that certain issues rise to the top, and then everyone gets anyone who, kind of goes left or goes right on a particular issue gets written off by an entire movement. I've really struggled, and I don't know the answer to this. I'm just going to throw it out there. It's something that I'm thinking about. What is loyalty to people that I know are good people who love Jesus, who have just committed their life to the cause and haven't been in line in the way that I think they should be in line? When do you write somebody off, and when do you not write somebody off? And what does it mean to be first and foremost loyal to the church, to my brothers and sisters in Christ? And by also recognizing that there has been a distinct, obvious, clear leftward drift based on the anecdotes and a million others that I could have brought. And so the loyalty to the person as a brother or sister in Christ when I disagree, these are challenges, for us. And one of the things I'm really grateful for is Chuck Colson was such a wonderful example. He was a wonderful example of being in the middle of all kinds of different relationships and expressions of both evangelicalism and beyond that, in broader swaths of Christianity. And so that's where I'm taking my cues from is his leadership, his example, and I'm still figuring this out. And thankfully, there's always dozens of listeners willing to write us and tell us this is what Chuck would have done. And I do appreciate hearing from that. I don't always agree, but I don't get mad when people say that, because I know they're trying to navigate these waters as well. And I really do believe that Chuck tried really hard not to assume motives and try to understand where are people coming from and the decisions that they make, while being very, very, very clear about the decision itself, whether it was the right one or the wrong one, to the best of his ability. And then speaking up when it matters and not speaking up when it doesn't matter. That's the other thing. I mean, Friedrich Nietzsche said, all truths are bloody truths to me. Like if I believe it, I'm going to fight and die over every single one of them. I'm not sure that's the posture we should take when we're talking about also being gracious with people. So anyway, that's a lot to say. I'm not sure we reached a conclusion here, but
my encouragement is to focus on your responsibilities to your local church community. That doesn't mean you can never do anything, outside of that or contribute outside of that. But one of the most fascinating pieces I wrote over the last couple of years was, it's kind of coming out of the COVID era. I wrote a piece for Christianity Today about how pastors in different church settings, I talked to some that are pastors of very, very large churches and some that are pastors of very small churches, how they handle it when people leave the church. And in particular, when people leave the church and don't say anything. So they sort of just ghost, like they stop coming or stop talking to anybody. And one of the most fascinating parts that came out of that was that this is not a thing that's like covered in seminary. Like pastors don't talk about how to handle this. And there's all these questions. If somebody stops coming, do you reach out to them? Or could that be seen as aggressive and inappropriate? Or, as if you're judging them? Or do you just let them go? Or is that forfeiting your duties as their shepherd? And, how it's a really, really difficult question. I'm not even sure how to answer it myself. I'm grateful that I'm not necessarily in that position. But one of the things that comes up about that is how often that's happening and what that kind of reveals about what a lot of us view church to be. So, for example, another thing I hear all the time is this stat. You'll hear it in pro-life groups and that, 3 out of 4 women who are facing a crisis pregnancy say that they would not be comfortable talking to anybody at their church about it. And usually this stat is brought out as an encouragement to churches to be more welcoming towards women who are in that situation. And I certainly think that's a good goal. But what I don't like is that there's no kind of focus on, if anybody is in a crisis situation for which they have, 10% of responsibility or whatever it is, or they're just in an uncomfortable situation, of course, it's going to be hard to bring that to somebody. Like what responsibility do we have to be vulnerable with our churches? My church can't help me unless I tell them what I need help with. And by my church, I don't just mean my pastor and the people in actual leadership, but I mean the people that are coming to church with me, like my church family. And I really do think that part of the problem here with the leftward drift is a misunderstanding of what church is and what it's supposed to be. And what this is the problem of coming to church every Sunday and thinking that this is supposed to reflect the global church community. And I expect to hear X, Y, and Z and to find these political sort of signals here, even if they're not going to say it outright, as opposed to I'm going to church on Sunday with a particular group of people that I've been called in a local way to be a part of God's family with. And that family is going to be going through something different than the church family down the street is going through. And this is a part of subsidiarity. I mean, things get more and more abstract the more you look at your individual church as it's supposed to be a perfect microcosm of what the perfect evangelical church should look like from East Coast to West Coast, as opposed to you're called to this one family. And what needs do they have and how can you contribute? Like, this is very much a ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country kind of thing. I think we do sort of look at our churches now less as a community like that and more either like consumers or honestly like the government. Like the government is what gives us what we need and what is attuned to our needs and sees our problems and predicts the future for us and prepares for us, as opposed to we participate in this. Like the government is us, and we have just as much responsibility to be vulnerable and be a part of the solution as, the infrastructure of our churches do. But you get into trouble when you implicitly tell your pastor that I expect you not just to pastor me, but you should also be appropriately pastoring every Christian in the United States of America every Sunday morning, even though you're practically not, but you should be behaving as if you are. That is a lot of pressure. And it is not surprising that would lead to all this sort of political confusion and difficulty with outside pressure. John, earlier in the show, we were talking about the importance of stories and circumstances and how they influence the way we see the world and cultural shifts. And there's a key difference here. This is something you and I were talking about yesterday, that Chuck Colson often made a distinction between ideology and worldview. And that can seem vague. I think, it's understandably confusing. Is there a difference there? But Chuck was always very vigilant, warning against ideology, but was obviously a proponent of worldview. And I was wondering if you could kind of give us an overview of the difference between those two things. And I'm thinking about it in the context of story, like we were talking about earlier, because it's one thing to have an idea of the story of the world and then take in new information and challenge your view of the world based on the new information you have. And then it's another thing to have a story of the world that is rigid, that you are dedicated to despite any new information that comes up. And then when you do get new information, either refusing to accept it or forcing it into, the confines of the story that you've already decided. And would that be a good way of understanding the difference between sort of worldview and ideology being the latter?
Yeah. I mean, obviously it depends on how we define all those terms. And, one of the things that sparked this was that we got this really great question. And the question actually emerged from one of our Colson fellows who astutely noticed that I was being hard on ideology, as I'd learned from Chuck, and advancing the idea of Christian worldview, which we do. And I think, you have to define, and, you could define worldview as an ideology, but I think that's really a disservice to worldview, because it's not just a set of ideas that you impose on the world. It's a set of assumptions and beliefs and a posture towards the world. And you look through a worldview at everything else. And like it or not, you have a worldview. You have a set of assumptions. You have a set of beliefs through which you see. So maybe that's semantics, but I do think part of it is whether whether it's something you're looking through or whether it's something you're imposing on the world. And that's why I oppose this idea of worldview as a theory of everything. I think materialism, for example, is a theory of everything. You have to actually suggest, if everything is material, that everything is material. And then what do you do with things like love and justice and courage and nobility? And what do you do with things like, honor and glory? I mean, these things aren't how do you make those physical? See, that's where the ideology breaks down. When you have an ideology of oppression, that every human interaction has to be understood through the suppressed oppressor narrative, and then it undermines the fact that if you look through the lens of a Christian worldview, you do have categories of oppression, and it makes better sense of who is oppressing and who is being oppressed, and the moral state of both, and also how to fix it. And I think that theory of everything is something that we need, to avoid, because Christianity is not just an ideology. It's just not one belief that you lay over everything. It's a way of thinking about life in the world. It's a way of thinking about the human condition. It's a way of thinking about the way God created the world. It's a way of thinking about what's wrong with the world and how to fix it. So it's a set of ideas that together come out of a narrative of Scripture. So that's what I see as the difference. And I know some folks are going to say, that sounds like semantics. That sounds like a distinction without a difference. I don't think it is, but I understand that it is difficult. And of course, look, at the end of the day, and I appreciate you brought this up a number of times, Christianity's true. If it's true, even if it is an ideology, it's the good one, and there are bad ones. And these things, really make a difference. So I think that there is a way that Christianity describes the world that's holistic, that's not reductionistic, and ideologies tend to reduce reality down to things that just aren't big enough to handle all the data, all the facts, all the aspects of the human condition. So that's the distinction that I understand. I think it's a helpful one to look at. And especially political ideologies become theories of everything. And when we think about what is our relationship with the powers that be politically, it's really important to keep those distinctions so that we can call balls and strikes, so that we can do the good that we can and, lessen evil wherever we can. I think these are helpful ways forward. And it's not an all or nothing, sort of engagement that we need to have.
Yeah, I think that's a good rubric. All right. Well, John, that is going to do it for the program this week. Let's talk about recommendations. I'll just go quickly here. It is the 20th anniversary of the release of a record called Add to the Beauty by Sara Groves, which is one of the sweetest and most just creative and introspective and interesting collection of songs and songwriting. She, of course, is a Christian singer and writer, and I just love, love, love her stuff, and especially this album. So I think she's re-releasing it because it's the 20th anniversary, but either way, just check it out. It's called Add to the Beauty by Sara Groves.
Well, since we're going back to old things, since Monday or Tuesday, let me see, what day is it? Wednesday is the anniversary of the death of the greatest theologian in Western Christianity, St. Augustine. And it's a wonderful example of both ideas and story emerged in this guy's life. So since you're going back, to old things, I'll go back to old things.
20 years ago is not that old, okay?
Classic evangelicalism. There's something else we should have added to that whole segment, which went way too long as it was, about
CCM.
Historical memory. But I will say Augustine's Confessions, specifically Augustine's Confessions, Book 4. And it's called Book 4, but it's really kind of a chapter where he tries to articulate both the knowability and unknowability of God. It's one of the most incredible pieces of writing about God, saying what we know. He actually talks about this. It's important to say what we know, and it's important to say we can't know. And he holds these tensions, this paradox together in a way. They're not conflicts. They're not contradictions. It's the difference between knowing fully and knowing sufficiently. And the fact that our knowledge of God is dependent on God wanting to be known. It also just kind of undermines the whole narrative in terms of the leftward drift of evangelicalism, which kind of boils down to, well, God would have never said that. Or God was learning. God was changing. It's just one of the most significant pieces on knowing God possible. And it's hard to imagine. You're like, okay, this isn't scripture, but it was inspired some way. I don't know how to draw those lines. But man, fantastic. And while you're at it, just read the whole book of Confessions. It's one of the first autobiographies in Western literature. and super important. So shout out to the great theologian, St. Augustine.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for listening to Breakpoint this week. For the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer alongside John Stonestreet, and we will see you all next week.